Hello and welcome to this edition of Creepy Stitchy. I am Shenandoah, otherwise known as Squishy. Thank you for joining me as we explore the Skinwalker Ranch. The Skinwalker Ranch is a large property in northeast Utah and on the southern border of the Uinta Reservation. It is a paranormal and UFO hotspot for those who believe in that sort of thing. Interest in the ranch began in the mid-1990s and has continued to have a resurgence in popularity since. It has been investigated by governmental agencies for the better part of a decade, and access to the site is still limited. Before we jump in, I want to cover a little bit of the history of this area. The earliest humans were believed to be nomadic hunters that had come over the Bering Sea land bridge. The first signs of people date back to about 10,000 years ago. They were nomadic, and the first permanent residents of the area didn't settle until 1200 BC. They were the ancient Pueblo people, and there were two main groups: the Anasazi, Navajo for enemy ancestors, and the Fremont people. Evidence suggests these people were farmers, and that they abandoned the area 1,300 years later, likely due to an extended drought that lasted about 300 years. Both people left rock paintings, some of which did have a supernatural flair, humans with animalistic traits such as wolf-like ears. It is thought that both people had an origin story that involved humans coming from a different alternate dimension, as well as the dimension where the dead spirits would cross into a new dimension. The Anasazi built a series of roadways that had no destination, but were thought to have been roads to where they thought these portals for the dead to cross over were. The Skinwalker Ranch lies in the heart of this territory. It is still to this day surrounded by Native American reservations, most notably the Ute, Navajo, and Apache, from which the Skinwalker legends hail. A Skinwalker is a shapeshifter. They were often thought of as men, but women and children were said to be capable of this as well. They could shift from their human form into that of an animal, typically a wolf, a bear, or an eagle, using the skin of that animal. Unlike the werewolves of Europe and the were-tigers of India or any other were creature, the Skinwalker used witchcraft to achieve the change. Skinwalkers were thought to be motivated by greed and evil intentions. According to legend, the way to become a Skinwalker was to kill a family member and surrender your humanity. Following the slaying, the Skinwalker would steal the soul of the fallen, which would give them the power to shift. Aside from that, there isn't much known about the Skinwalkers due to some Native American cultural beliefs that forbid speaking openly of them, lest they draw the attention of the Skinwalkers. While many tribes in the area have legends about the Skinwalker, our deepest understanding comes from the legends of the Navajo. Unlike the medicine man or healers, the Skinwalker is a deceiver. Using the darkness of the night, a Skinwalker would skulk out to do harm and cause pain to those they felt had wronged them. They could steal the voices of their victims' loved ones, often crying like a child, or a woman in distress, to lure out their victim into the darkness. They could then enter the mind of the victim, forcing the victim to inflict harm on themselves. Looking at a Skinwalker would allow them to enter your mind and paralyze the victim with fear. They could then feed off that fear and become even stronger. They could cast spells and curses, often using bones of infants. It is also said that they would kill any who saw their face to keep their identity a secret. Ute legend says that they are cursed with the Skinwalkers from the time when the Spanish first arrived and introduced the Ute people to horses and the slave trade. They began raiding the area, stealing as many resources and captives as they could to sell or trade. Because of their violence, the Ute began to be tormented by Skinwalkers. They were thought to be especially heavy along the canyons in the Green River, otherwise known as the Path of the Skinwalker. They attributed the Skinwalkers to a curse laid on them by the Navajo as a form of vengeance. Even today, it is rumored that the Ute avoid these areas along the southern border of their reservations, right where the Skinwalker Ranch is located. There is only one entrance to the Skinwalker Ranch, a single dirt road. On the ranch there are 3 homesteads. The first homestead on the east is where the family lived and the Crows were. The middle homestead consisting of long abandoned buildings and seems to be the most paranormally active. The third is to the west, and it is surrounded by tall trees and underbrush, and is generally overgrown. To the south there is a river, and to the north there is a sandstone ridge. One time Mr. Sherman was using his post holer to add new sections of fence. He set the tool down, turned to do something, and the tool had disappeared. He was alone, but at the time thought one of his family members had played a trick and asked everyone where they put it. He asked everybody, and nobody knew, and no one admitted to it. He was forced to buy a new one, only to discover the old one 40 feet up a tree. How such a large tool could get that far up a tree with only a few seconds was relatively unexplainable to them. Another time, the men moved a huge pile of corral poles to the canal, a task that took 4 hours. They stopped for lunch, and when they returned to work, the whole pile had been moved back to the original spot, off by just 1 inch, in the space of half an hour. Another time, a ton, like a literal ton, of stacked corded wood would be moved from one side of the field to the other, again only during about a 30-minute time period. One time, at the third homestead, they found huge holes dug out of the ground like someone had used a gigantic ice cream scoop to remove the soil, with no piles of dirt anywhere left behind. Some of these scoops would have weighed hundreds of pounds, and there were dozens of them. They would hear noises like mining underground, loud metallic banging and whining. Anytime they dug into the ground or removed tree stumps, the noises increased, and they couldn't tell if it was from underground or the ridge. And it bears repeating that when they had bought the property, there was a strange rider in the sale that if they ever wanted to dig on the property, they had to inform the previous owners. Maybe it's because of that activity. The Shermans did take great pride in their herd of Simmental and Black Angus cattle. They were of high quality and fetched huge prices at auction. They were proud of the fact that they rarely lost more than 1% of the herd to predation and herd mismanagement, where most farmers routinely lost 5% or more. They were experienced, successful, and dedicated to their herd. But the Shermans began to have problems with cattle dying mysteriously. They began dying in ways associated with cattle mutilations. The family noted that the carcasses were also avoided by scavengers. Later that first summer, they began to hear strange voices and even see UFOs. Pastures would light up, beams of light would shoot out of the ground to illuminate the sky. They would hear mocking voices in unknown languages emanating from just feet above their head. Car batteries would suddenly die, cars would stall out. They even saw portals with unfamiliar stars on the other side open up in the sky. Following the UFOs, they began to be terrorized by blue orbs. They would emerge from these orange-hued portals that would open up in the sky. The orbs, when they came too close, would fill them with terror and fear. One night, Mr. Sherman noted an orb by 3 of his dogs, and he let them off their chain, and the dogs chased after it. Not long after they disappeared into the woods, the dogs yelped in pain and fear, and they did not return that night. The next morning, when Mr. Sherman went to find his lost dogs, All he could find were 3 scorch marks in the ground, with greasy blobs of goo in the center of the scorch marks. After that, the Shermans had had enough, and they sold the ranch to Mr. Bigelow and moved off the ranch less than 2 years after purchasing it. Robert Bigelow is a man born in 1945 in Las Vegas. He had always had a keen interest in science. He was young enough to have seen several of the nuclear desert tests conducted by the United States government at the Nevada security site in the 1950s. Those events convinced Robert Bigelow that he wanted to establish his own space program. With such a lofty goal, Mr. Bigelow threw himself into his education and business ventures to accumulate the money he would need to see his dream become a reality. After high school, he studied banking and real estate at the University of Nevada and later Arizona State University. For 30 years, he dedicated himself to commercial real estate, primarily in the development of motels, hotels, and apartments. In 2007, Mr. Bigelow divested himself from most of his properties and has since used his wealth to finance the activity of the Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, BASS, B-A-A-S-S. The primary goal for him was affordable and accessible space habitats. His first 2 modules were launched with the assistance of the Russian space program and had some success. Going back to 1996, Mr. Bigelow had an interest in UFOs and other paranormal activity and was deeply attracted to the stories of the Sherman Ranch and purchased the property for $200,000. At the time, Mr. Bigelow was referred to by a journalist, Zach Van Eck, as easily the most prominent American financier in the paranormal research field. Shortly after the purchase of the ranch, Mr. Bigelow had observation towers built and hired 2 scientists and a veterinarian to take up full-time residence on the ranch to observe and document any and all activity. This led to the formation of the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS. NIDS was financed by the government for many years. The NIDS team included a total of 15 scientists, not your garden variety Bigfoot hunter or ghost hunter, but actual scientists who risked their whole careers to study the phenomena at the Skinwalker Ranch. So, after purchasing the property, Mr. Bigelow had those tall observation towers built to observe everything, surrounding them with tall metal fences. They would leave dogs in the fences overnight. The dogs were both considered friends, companions, and a scientific tool. The dogs would act as a biosensor and could detect any activity before we could and alert the scientists. However, the dog runs themselves proved to be problematic. Frequently, the gates were opened by an unseen and unknown trickster. They tried thick wires, but those disappeared. And then they upgraded to heavy-duty padlocks, and those disappeared as well. All within sight of cameras. Just there 1 minute, gone the next. The research team was composed of Ph.D. level scientists, and they were optimistic that they could figure out the phenomena. They thought they could rigorously monitor activity with sensors and video cameras. However, it always seemed that the activities would happen just off camera, and it always seemed to know when it was being observed. Cameras did catch a few incidents, like the blue orbs that seemed to move intelligently, as well as light displays and mysterious shadowy objects that looked like structures. Most sightings seemed to happen in the middle of the second homestead. At first, it seemed almost nightly at the second homestead. Things were active. It lit up with glowing lights and orbs and strange, bright, glowing orange orbs that seemed like a portal. The rancher, Mr. Sherman, who stayed on to help the team, saw one open up with a different and had a different sky, and he watched a small black object fly out of it. Another time, a scientist and the rancher saw a portal open into a 3-foot-long opening or tunnel. With night vision goggles, they observed the tunnel hovering about 4 feet off the ground. There was a humanoid figure that army crawled out before standing up and running off into the night. One of the biggest tricks this trickster played on the team was when the rancher and his wife, they still had cattle on the property. They had 4 2,000-pound bulls, their best and most expensive stock. They had found some strange tracks down by the middle homestead and were trying to figure out exactly what they were. So the rancher and his wife were in their truck headed over there to investigate. They had at this point lost over a dozen animals to cattle mutilation and were worried for the bulls. They had a conversation about how financially devastated they would be if something happened to the bulls. When they came home, the corral was empty. There were no bulls. So obviously the rancher and his wife stopped, and they were investigating. For some reason, Mr. Sherman decided to check a little trailer, sort of like somewhere between a shed and a horse trailer in size. And inside, looking through a window, all 4 bulls were in the shed. Now we all know how wild bulls can be, but they were very calm, almost as entranced, while they were squished up against each other. To get one bull into the enclosure would be next to impossible, and there are 4. They would have been more likely to tear the shed apart than docilely walk in to cuddle up against each other. These were not Ferdinand. In fact, when Mr. Sherman called out to his wife to show her this strange happening, the bulls seemed to snap out of their trance, and they did tear their way out of the shed. It took the rancher over 4 hours to get the bulls back into their corral, but somehow they had all been put in a shed in less than an hour without opening the door. We know the door wasn't open because there were still cobwebs going from the ceiling to the door of the shed. We don't know how the bulls got in there. Upon examining the shed and the corral, the scientists found that the whole corral had been magnetized. The magnetization would fade in a few days, but it was a pretty strange finding. I also do need to note that the activity wasn't exclusive to the ranch, but it did seem to be the epicenter of the activity. Many neighbors reported seeing UFOs and orbs, and in fact, the region, about 75 will say they believe in UFOs, and the rest will say they weren't sure. It is very rare to find somebody who says they don't think they are at all possible. The author and journalist George Knapp documented many first-hand accounts from the people in the region, and those are all in his book, The Hunt for the Skinwalker. For time's sake, I will not be going into them, but if you're interested, there is the book and the movie, which is very interesting. After about a year and a half of constant observation at the Sherman Ranch, all activity seemed to die, like it was bored of toying with the scientists. But there were still some activity. March 10th in 1997, the Shermans went out to tag some calves and have them weighed. They tagged and weighed the first calf around 87 pounds, and nothing seemed amiss, but they did note a strong musky smell. However, they didn't think anything of it till later. Because it's a farm, there are always smells around. They left the calf with its mother and went on to the next calf, about 300 yards away. It was a flat field, and they did have a clear view of the entire pasture. About 30 minutes later, their dog started growling and barking with its hair on the end, from at the direction that they had come from towards the house. It lasted only about a minute before the dog ran off in the opposite direction, never to be seen again. Granted, the Shermans didn't know that the dog would go missing at the time, so they wanted to investigate the first calf, where they found the mother running in distress and limping. They found the calf, completely stripped of meat, from the neck all the way down to the tail. On the head, the ear they had just tagged was missing. It had been cleanly sliced off. And there was no blood near the body. The scientists gathered samples and tested them using different unaffiliated labs, which reported the meat and tissues had been removed using sharp metallic tools, not animal predation. After the conclusion of the NIDS team, Robert Bigelow sold the ranch to a new owner who refused to be identified for fear of losing business. He has been interviewed anonymously, and he has added more security enhancements and upgraded the equipment to get better results. And it has worked. He has gotten credible pictures of UFOs on camera. They also began studying ultrasonic and infrasonic frequencies and have noticed a pattern of unexplainable signals. Beyond that, there isn't much information that I have found, so this is where the story ends, for now. As for me, I really don't know what to make of all this. It's a little bit of a cobbled mixture of aliens, UFO, Bigfoot, ancient legends, possible military testing, all sorts of things going on. So I don't have a theory for you. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you, and have a wonderful night.